Welcome to UK Column. I'm Ben Rubin, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Gloria Moss, PhD, who is a respected academic, researcher, and author of a number of books, most notably Why Men Like Straight Lines and Women Like Polka Dots, Gender, Design, and Marketing, and the Dark Side of Academia. Welcome to UK Column, Gloria.
Hi, Ben.
On the 16th of April this year, 2025, 5 judges of the UK Supreme Court unanimously agreed that, and I quote, the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex. They then went on to say that their shared biology leads to shared disadvantage and discrimination. Now, in some quarters of society, this was deemed to be a controversial ruling. In most other quarters of society, this was deemed to be little more than common sense. What's your take on this, Gloria?
Well, we've seen those same divisions in opinion for decades now. So the very different reactions come as no surprise. And some of the earliest commentators on sex fueled, I would say, this division. So we could talk about that because the roots of this division in opinion go back several decades. Starting with Simone de Beauvoir, for example, in France, who really kick-started the feminist movement with the book The Second Sex, which had the very bold statement, one is not born, but becomes a woman. So right from the get-go, here's a prominent author questioning biological sex. One is not born, but becomes a woman. And the author went on to say, a man is in the right in being a man. It is the woman who is in the wrong. Well, you can see a photo of Simone, who was best mate, shall we say, with Jean-Paul Sartre in Paris. They were both students at the École Normale Supérieure. I believe they came in first and second place. And what do you think of this photo, then, of Simone de Beauvoir towering over Jean-Paul Sartre?
She's quite a striking individual.
Certainly striking and very tall. Significantly taller than Jean-Paul Sartre, was some might question whether this was indeed a biologically born female, and if that was not the case, then you revisit her sentence: "One is not born, but becomes a woman." You look at that in an altogether different light, but that's supposition. Who knows? But this started a train of thought that questioned the roots of femininity and biology. And if we fast forward a few decades, then we arrive in America with Judith Butler. And I know you're interested in Judith Butler. Ben was, perhaps still is, I need to check, professor of comparative literature at California University. And here's what Judith Butler said. If the immutable character of sex is contested, perhaps this construct called sex is as culturally constructed as gender. And here she is arguing, as she does in Gender Trouble, the book, that gender and sex are no more than social constructs. Note, not biological constructs. And very recently, in 2021, Judith Butler went on to state that the category of woman can and does change, and we need it to be that way. So this is very much at odds with the ruling of the Supreme Court. And this kind of view, as propounded by Judith Butler, Simone de Beauvoir, has an enormous following. Because they've made a point of having a large following, shall we say, and the system has encouraged people to follow this line of thinking. So not surprising then that the Supreme Court ruling, as you say, Ben, had a mixed reaction. But of course, that's not the whole story. And there are some proponents, some powerful proponents outside of the Supreme Court for the view that men and women are very much fashioned by their biology. So we could talk about that a little bit, some of those voices speaking out on the other side of the fence, if you like.
Absolutely. I think that would be a fantastic direction for us to take. I am particularly interested in Judith Butler, as you've mentioned, because she seems to be exerting an extraordinary amount of influence over the progressive liberal left in the UK at the moment. As I understand it, she's actually based in London right now. She may still have an academic position in California, as you mentioned, but I believe she's spending quite a bit of time here in the UK and is doing a lot of podcast appearances and interviews with various different media platforms. And actually, this quote that you shared here is really quite striking. If the immutable character of sex is contested, well, then maybe it is socially constructed. Well, who's contesting it? You're contesting it. The people in your ideological lineage are the ones contesting it. Doesn't mean that it should be contested. It just happens to be what you've done. And this second quote that you provided, the category of woman can and does change, and we need it to be that way. What do we need it to be that way for, Judith Butler? That's a really, really striking thing to say. But back to your thoughts on people speaking up on the other side of the debate.
Now, on the other side of the fence, there's some very powerful voices. For example, you can find a TED talk given by an academic from Brown University in the US. That's Dr. Allison McGregor, MD. She's got a bit of a sense of humor. She says, women are not just men with boobs and tubes. And she actually talks about anatomical and physiological differences that go way beyond immediately observable sex-related properties. It's well worth listening to her talk because she actually elaborates on the view that these differences are so profound that symptoms of illness, and indeed the treatment of those illnesses, should be, well, they manifest differently and should be treated in different ways. Just a couple of quick examples. She says that acute coronary syndrome presents differently in males and females because the blood vessels around the heart in females are smaller than in men. The treatments will be different as a consequence. So that's a very powerful voice, I think. And then an emerita professor of psychology, Diane Halpern, also from the US. I think she was skeptical originally about wading into this debate on sex difference, but in the end, she came round to seeing the power of biological sex. And she talked about the visuospatial, which will be a feature, a very special feature of what we talk about later today. She talks about variations in the visuospatial abilities of males and females as amongst the most robust and persistent of all the cognitive sex differences. So just to repeat, she's a highly decorated professor of psychology. You can look her up on the web. And she states that variations in the visuospatial abilities of males and females, which will be a focus of our discussion today, Ben and myself, that these are amongst the most robust and persistent of all the cognitive sex differences. Indeed, I've read it myself that after height, differences in the visuospatial skills of males and females are the most robust of all the sex differences after height, which I think few people would dispute, that on balance men are taller than females. And then a third voice, this is Professor of Psychology at Cambridge, Simon Baron Cohen, author of a book, 2007, The Essential Difference. And very striking, some of the research that he's undertaken that's described in this book. He describes work that he did with his team, looking at the perceptions of one-day-old babies. These are babies in the world for just a single day. And what he and his team documented was the fact that one-day-old boy babies fixate much more on things than they do on people. And conversely, the one-day-old girl babies, he found that they respond more empathetically to the distress of others than do boy babies. This is what he found with one-day-old babies. And in one of the books that you mentioned that I've written, Gender, Design and Marketing, which goes in depth into this topic, I review some of the fascinating studies that were conducted comparing the drawings and paintings created by very young children right up to adolescent children. And there was one study conducted in Japan by Iijima, that was the surname of the researcher, with a couple of other researchers, where they compared the drawings of kindergarten children. And here's one of their findings, which I think correlates quite nicely with Baron Cohen's findings. What they found was that girls were significantly more likely to feature human motifs in their drawings, and also flowers, we'll come to that later, and that the boys, they found, were significantly more likely to draw moving objects, such as cars, trains, rockets, and aircraft. So these are inanimate objects, non-living. And in fact, that finding emerges from other studies comparing the drawings and paintings of boys and girls. And then I've done my own research over a span of about 20 years. So we have these powerful voices. We've got an MD, we've got a professor of psychology who's much decorated. We have Professor Simon Baron-Cohen. And of course, I should also mention, I think, Professor Geary in America, whose book on cognitive sex differences, and each chapter picks up on a different sense and documents the extensive differences across each of the 5 senses. That book, written by Professor Geary, was published by the American Psychological Association. So there's some powerful figures at powerful institutions arguing that, if you like, cognitive sex difference is hardwired. And not just cognitive differences, as we saw from the doctor, physiological differences and the way illness manifests and needs to be treated. And I can talk about my research on the visuospatial, which is the area I focused on for about 20 years, until the going got too rough. And then I moved on to another topic, which the going proved to be pretty rough there too. I talked about that a bit with your colleague last week when we were talking about universities. That was the subject of best practice leadership. And you might think that everybody would want to learn about best practice leadership, but it didn't seem that it was flavour of the month in certain parts of the university system. But that's another story for another day. So we could talk about the visuospatial, and I know that's a field in which you've worked yourself, Ben.
Indeed it is, yes. I spent many years in the design industry and actually doing a lot of research around particularly looking at the way that people interact with digital interfaces. So was doing a lot of work, particularly when the new mobile phones were coming in, so the smartphones, and actually understanding how to collapse incredible amounts of functionality into this tiny little piece of screen that we have, that we interact with everything through these days. So yeah, this is definitely an area of interest to me. But the angle that you take on it, I think, is particularly interesting because it's more on the creative side of things, which I really enjoy. And you just used the phrase a moment ago that there are some powerful voices who are making the case. I actually would say it's more than that. You've got some powerful voices who are demonstrating beyond the shadow of a doubt that there are differences between boys and girls, men and women. I think that's abundantly clear, to be honest with you. The one that really jumped out at me from the examples that you just shared there was from Simon Baron Cohen, and this idea that even at 1 day old, newborn babies, boys are more interested in looking at things, girls are more interested in looking at other people. Yeah, and this is one of the things that Jordan Peterson, not so long ago, would talk about at quite some length. The idea that men are interested in things, women are interested in people, women are more social, they're more caring, they're more empathetic, men are more interested in building stuff out there in the world, right? And these used to be things that we just understood as being true, but apparently it now sounds like we have to provide evidence for this through lab-based testing, and the lab-based testing has proven it to be true too. So this is fantastic. Let's get on to the visual component, because this is obviously your area of specialism, and you've provided some examples of us that we can look at of the differences between art and design as created by men and women.
That's absolutely right. And I embarked on this study of about 20 years plus by going into art colleges where there were foundation course students, because I wanted to compare the work of the men and the women from students who hadn't had too much training. I have a background in industry as a training and development manager, and I'm very conscious of the effects that education and training can have, and can even change natural impulses. So this is why I started with foundation course students, because that's the year that people follow prior to doing a full degree at art college or university. And I was looking for classes where a single project was set for the students, and then I could photograph and collect the responses of the male and female students in the group. And the first sample that came my way was responses to a project brief to design a set of luxury chocolate boxes. And you can see them there. There were 8 altogether, and 4 were the work of the male students, and 4 were the work of female students in the group. And you might be looking at those and asking yourself, I wonder who designed which. And I did quite an in-depth study to examine the features in these 8 chocolate boxes. And this is a bit like Blue Peter, where after a lot of work, they just show you the end product. So I'm going to show you the graph that illustrates the findings from this study that I undertook. And on this graph, you can see that there are 2 different lines, and the top line denotes the characteristics that are present in the chocolate boxes designed by the male students, and the lower line denotes the features that characterize the chocolate boxes designed by the female students. And where you can see divergence between those 2 lines is the area of greatest disparity between the design productions or creations of the men and the women. And so then you just look to the bottom axis and you'll see the features where these differences emerged most strongly. And you can see that they emerge in relation to the volume of color used, in relation to the linearity, in other words, the extent to which the shapes use straight lines or round shapes. And yet, indeed, those chocolate boxes with rounded shapes were the creation of the female foundation students. And then the third area of disparity relates to the technicality of the drawings, with the male designs deemed to have a far more technical appearance than the female. So just to recap, where colour is concerned, the female designs come out as more colourful. Where linearity is concerned, the male designs have more straight lines and the female designs are more rounded in shape. And where technical appearance is concerned, the male design looks more technical and professional, because that technical look is what is often taught. And incidentally, the differences were off the wall statistically. They were as high higher difference in statistical terms as you could possibly imagine at the 0.001 level of significance. And this work of this kind had never been done before. This was a first, if you like. And it was done with a fair degree, high degree, I would say, of rigor. I didn't impose these categories. I went through an elaborate first stage where I asked respondents to elicit the categories that were most striking in terms of differentiators between the male and female designs. And then I asked a further group of students to rate the designs according to those features. That's how we arrived at this graph. And they say a picture says 1,000 words. What we can do now is just look at a couple of examples, because we haven't really got time today for much more than that, I think, of real life professional design, if you like, and see what you think then of these designs. And I know when you looked at these before, you were particularly struck by the drinks cans, the images of the drinks cans. So maybe let's look at those next. And how did I find out about the design history of these cans? Well, quite simply, I invited myself along to a design agency in London, and they were very kind. They organised a meeting with a number of their designers who brought along their portfolios, and that enabled me to identify the gender and identity of those who designed these cans. So you can probably see that on the left is a can for Strongbow. You've got a square shape in the middle with a man with a bow. It looks like a man to me, the size of the head. Theme of violence, if you like. And on the right, you've got cans of a very different nature, fruit juices, much less three-dimensional, more humorous, more light-hearted, shall we say, and definitely more colourful than the can on the left. And notice the typeface as well, the differences there. How would you compare the typefaces? Would you say one was more regular in appearance than the other? Then?
The ones on the right are certainly more playful. Yes, I think these ads are absolutely beautiful. It also suggests to me that there could potentially be some cultural differences here as well, because when I look at the cans on the right, I'm not entirely familiar with this brand, Seltzer, but it looks more European to me. There's something about it that reminds me of maybe being on holiday in the south of France and having one of these nice drinks outside a cafe, whereas the Strongbow is, it's a rather different experience.
Yeah, I don't know about the brand, but both designers were working out of this design agency in Marylebone, actually, in London. And the designer on the left, if we had to guess the gender, is
I'm going to say a man. I'm thinking a man.
Yeah, and the designer on the right was a female. And let me just refer to one of those studies on paintings that I referred to. This was an American study, 1982, by McNeef, examined almost 2,000 drawings by children aged 6 to 8. What they found was that violence featured in 27% of the boys' drawings, and only, wait for this, 0.3% of the girls' drawings. So here we have an image of violence. It's a bit of a clue. We've got the regular typeface, the square. There's a lot telling us there that this is the work of a male designer. And in the workshops that I've conducted, I show people innumerable images so that after you've seen a large number of these, you pick up very quickly the differences in the designs created by males and females. Well, that's creations. The next big question relates to preferences. Nobody had ever done any studies asking themselves, how would men and women react to those cans? Would the men prefer the strongbow, or would they be equally happy with the cans on the right? And similar questions would arise in respect to the women. No, nobody'd asked those questions before. So I conducted a number of what I call preference tests to get an answer. And I have an answer. Drinks cans was one of the stimuli that I showed to unsuspecting male and female students from 5 countries. So what we are seeing here are the preferences of students from 5 countries. And all of the results are highly significant. Highly significant. And I won't keep you, won't keep the answer from you any longer. What I found was a very, very strong tendency for men to prefer the designs created by men, and for women to prefer the designs created by the women. And this is beyond contest because of the strength of the statistical effect. I did put in 2 other stimuli, some Christmas cards, but we haven't had time to discuss those today. And so 2 findings emerged. Firstly, that the differences in the creations, the design creations of males and females, are statistically very different, and likewise for their preferences, with men preferring the designs created by men and women, or girls preferring the designs created by girls or women. Well, 2 questions might be popping up in your mind then at this point. One is, what are the implications? And because of your background, you might be thinking, oh my goodness, there are vast implications for marketing. That was certainly my thoughts after I achieved these findings. And then the second big question is the why. What is steering these differences? So should we look at these 2 questions, the implications and the why?
Absolutely. The first thing that came to my mind, Gloria, was how can we turn this to our competitive advantage?
Exactly. Because now we have, I call it the science, really, of the visuospatial. I think up until now, when I look at commercial design, it's potluck what people create. And very often I think designers create what they like. Why would they have any reason not to do that? And if they're men, they might think that their own preferences are universal and carry across to women. But my studies suggest very much otherwise. And incidentally, I put all of this work through peer review over a number of years. And so it's I don't know how many peer review articles I've written on it. I've written about 80 altogether, and maybe half of that was on this topic. And then 2 books, or 3 books, because I've written a book on personality, and my PhD topic examined the effect of the personality, nationality, and sex of the designer on websites and their creation, and the effect of those 3 factors, personality, nationality, and sex, on people's preferences. So it's robust, shall we say, this work. Implications. Commercial advantage you mentioned, Ben. Now, a lot of people may not be aware of proportion of purchases overall made by men and women. If you had to hazard a guess, just sort of quietly think in your mind if you're viewing this, what proportion of purchases overall are made by men and women? And then I'll tell you what researchers have found. What researchers have found is that something like 83% of all purchases are made by women. Yeah, you heard right. Women are the dominant purchasers. So if you had to select an aesthetic in which to dress up your kettle or your car or your retail interior, you would select the female aesthetic, would you not? And yet when I walk around, and I have done quite a large number of consultancy projects for firms, advising on this, they're not factoring in the fact that there are at least two aesthetics from which they can select and model their interior around all their products. And so many firms are missing the opportunity of which you speak, and the commercial advantage. And if they understand this science of visual perception, then they can cherry pick the features depending on their target market. And it becomes quite simple. Well, I say quite simple. I remember doing a workshop for an all-male web design team who were responsible for a website called Bounty that served up new products, served up products for new mums. And they asked me in that their website was predictably, as most websites are, 87% of website designers are men, so it's not surprising. They're very masculine. Think of an Amazon website, for example. Very few colors, very linear. That's prototypically male. So it was with this website, and I explained, as I am now, but in much more detail, the features of this new science. And then they showed me the website that they created after the workshop. And I would say it was perfectly configured for that market of new mums. But when I looked again at the website about 6 months later, can you guess what I saw then with that website?
They changed it back, I would imagine.
Exactly. In conformity with their own personal preference, which you can understand. So it's all about, I think, understanding these differences. This is diversity at its best, really. It's understanding and using, in the case of commerce, for business advantage. And if you like, putting on the spectacles of the other gender and asking yourself, what would appeal to them? This is to adopt what is known in the trade as the outside-in perspective. And we were talking about this on the phone, weren't we, Ben? And I was saying, in my experience, very few organizations are configured, set up to deliver an outside-in perspective. They're very inward-leaning, in my experience. And it seems your experience was not dissimilar to my own.
No, there was it was very similar, and large organisations in particular. I think this is true of people in general, and the organisations are made up of people, right? But they had a tendency to ship their org charts, how we used to describe it. So if you were looking at them from the outside, and you could go across the different pieces of what they were supposed to be delivering to you as a customer, you could actually see the gaps between the marketing team and the customer service team and the people who are designing and delivering the products. And part of the job for us was helping to reflect that back into the business and provide some external perspective backed up with evidence through doing user research and analytics so that they could address those issues. But without that, it was actually very difficult for them, potentially, I would say even impossible for them to gain the level of self-awareness to be able to address those issues. So no, my experience is completely aligned with what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I was shocked on a couple of occasions when I was asked to run workshops for some very large companies. When I asked the obvious starting question, which is, can you describe your market to me in terms of its demographics? I was met with blank stares. And these large companies, one was in the pharmaceutical field and the other one was in the automotive field, they didn't have a handle at all on their market. And in the case of the automotive, they had no awareness of the fact that more than 50% of new cars in America are actually purchased by women, and that women influence up to 80% of all car purchases, spending, well, at the time I did this work, more than $200 billion on new cars. So no surprises then that this firm's website was thoroughly masculine in its orientation. It's what the web design team liked, I imagine. They didn't know who their market was, and they had no reason to do anything different. And if we're talking automotive, my goodness, there are opportunities for improvement. Anybody listening to this from the world of cars or any other mechanical device, hoovers, kettles. I had a female designer who went on subsequently to work for Habitat, designed me up some kettles, and you've never seen kettles of the kind that she designed for me. They would have massive appeal to females. And so it would be with cars. I mean, I did quite a lot of research looking into the issue of car design and found only one car that had ever gone in, one car designed by a female designer that had ever gone into commercial production. Only one single car. And you can guess amongst the cars that you can see on that slide, which is the single car that was designed by the female designer, Julianne Blasi. And yes, it's the one on the top left, the BMW Z4, little lovely looking sports car. Well, to my eyes anyway. I don't know about Ben's eyes. So we have this phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, don't we? And the same applies in the world of marketing. And commercial firms just need to identify their market demographically. I would say sex is a really important variable. And we can go and talk about some of the biological factors behind these differences that make it, that make it the powerful variable that it is. Of course, other variables, very equally important, nationality, how you market to a French audience would be very different from how you'd market to a British one, for example. And I know you've done some work in that area as well, I think, Ben.
Yeah, I've been in France a few times on business. I think the thing that always struck me, and it completely aligns with what you're talking about here, is that when we went to talk to them as designers, the French would always interpret design as aesthetics, and the English would always interpret design as mechanics and engineering. And those are very distinct things, but it's completely aligned with what we're talking about.
Oh, that's very interesting, because the field of industrial design, and I believe there's a museum of industrial design near Tower Bridge, that's so different. That's a very engineering-based design, just as you say. And the aesthetic component seems very much an afterthought. Now, people might disagree with what I've said there, and it'd be interesting to hear people's thoughts, but that's absolutely in line with what you're saying there. And they say that if you had to simplify things, men will follow function and women will prioritize style. And if you're comparing national cultures, then you'll find that France is deemed to be a more feminine society than the Anglo countries. So maybe this is one reason why they prioritize aesthetics more highly than Anglo people do. Who knows? But shall we talk about some of the why of this before perhaps looking at some further implications beyond the world of business?
Yes, let's do that, because you've actually looked into the differences in perception between men and women, which I think is particularly interesting. And a lot of that, I believe, is to do with the traditional roles that we would have played in society.
Oh, well, yes. And when we say traditionally play, I've read that for 99% of human history, men and women were respectively hunters and gatherers. Yeah, we weren't sitting at desks like we are today. That's a very recent origin. So, yes, for a very, very long span of human history, 1.7 million BC, right through to 10,000 BC, men and women were hunters and gatherers, respectively. And that spans the Lower Paleolithic and the end of the Pleistocene epochs. And it seems that men and women's visuospatial skills have developed in response to their lives as hunters and gatherers, respectively. So, if you like, this is sociology in the long term. Sociologists look at immediate social influences on human behavior. Some, what they call evolutionary psychologists, are predisposed to look at the long-term influence of society, of social activity on psychological elements, and that includes cognitive elements. And so if you trawl through the psychology literature, my goodness, what you discover is fascinating. This is a peer review literature, not that peer review is always right, as I was discussing with Diane just last week. And I think we need to be very mindful of that. But some very, very consistent findings emerge from the psychology literature. What do we find? We find that on average, would you believe it, men's eyes are spaced 5 millimeters further apart than women's. Take measures if you want at your next party and draw your own conclusions. But one of the effects of eyes being further apart is to provide greater stereoscopic vision, which of course is very useful if you're a hunter. Women have more P cells for identifying objects, which is really helpful if you're gathering berries. Men have more cells for tracking objects. Of course, that's a hunter skill, isn't it? And when we come to colour vision, that's fascinating, because you probably know that there's a much higher instance of colour blindness in men than in women. It's about 8% in men and 0.5% in women. And did you know that being colourblind gives you an advantage? You may not feel like that a lot of the time, but it allows you to see through camouflage. So if you're a hunter, of course, that's tremendously helpful. And I discovered that the army goes out of its way to recruit colourblind people for that very reason. They can see through camouflage. And colourblindness manifests on the X chromosome, and it's much more likely to manifest in men with their single X chromosome than in women with their 2 X chromosomes. It's a greater chance that one of them won't have the colourblind gene. And final difference, last but by no means least, we have colour pigments in our eyes, men and women both. No man has more than 3 colour pigments, and some American researchers wrote a very learned article suggesting that up to 50% of women have a 4th colour pigment. Now, that may not sound a big deal, having 1 additional colour pigment, but my goodness, it makes a difference. It means having that extra colour pigment that you go from seeing millions of colours, that's the men, to seeing hundreds of millions of colours, and that's the women. And why would that have helped women? Because in that 99% of human history time, women spent their time as gatherers, so they needed to discern the ripe from the unripe berries. They were the managers of the day. They were managing base camp. They were building, according to anthropologists, the buildings, and they were designing the accoutrements that go inside the building. And they were the managers. They had to discern whether people's cheeks were flaring up. They were about to go into an incendiary row. And likewise with the children, whether they had a temperature or not. So colour served women very well in this world with a division of labour as between hunters and gatherers. So it served us well then. The vision now, the advantage, these different advantages, I would say they're lost, because if we go back to your point about commerce, Ben, and commercial advantage, senior people in design and marketing tend to be men, and they often serve up design that's hunter, if we like, in style, that's informed by the male hunter vision. And yet the customers, as we've said, are in the majority, 83% female. And so what we really need is a gatherer style served up to those purchasers, different for some products. Those that are where the customers are predominantly men. Petrol is an example, for example. Then you'd want that male aesthetic. But it really doesn't have much of a place if the purchaser is female. And often the female is the purchaser of products for men. I was talking to the head of menswear at Marks and Spencer on one occasion, I think when I was doing my inaugural lecture, and he said that the main purchasers of menswear was actually women. Here we have it. We have hunter and we have gatherer vision. And is there any way that these innate differences can possibly be changed? I mean, they can be changed a little. People's responses, their behaviors can perhaps be changed by training. I think we need a lot of repeat training, as I said earlier. We can try and change the behavior, but can we actually change the perception? I doubt it very much, because it's so hardwired. I think we've still got a little bit of time left. We could talk about the implications beyond business, if you like, for history, for fine art.
Absolutely, I think we should do. I think we should also just add, Gloria, that many men who have been the subject of derision and criticism at home for not being able to find things in the kitchen cupboards or wherever else it might be, now have conclusive scientific proof that it's because they are not biologically predisposed for doing such things. I think that's probably the most important thing that's happened in our conversation this afternoon.
Yes. Yeah, men's object location memory is definitely poorer than that of women. But I think my view is, let's celebrate these differences. They're both wonderful. We need both of these skills, the hunter and the gatherer. The world would be so much the poorer without it. And if we deny the existence of these differences, then we deny history, I think. We can look at that in a bit. And we can also cause discrimination, when you read out the Supreme Court ruling, there was a reference there to the discrimination that can follow from biological difference. Shall we have a quick look at some of the implications for history and fine art? Historically, the first paintings, as we know, emerged in cave art. And this was, way back in the period, 30,000 to 23,000 BC, way back. And it's very interesting if you read commentators and art historians, how they describe the original cave artists. Here's Paul Johnson in his book, Art, A New History. He says, and I quote, that the cave artists were great men who gave themselves airs. And then there's a Frenchman, Jean Clot. There's a cave named after the cave that he discovered in France. And he described the artist of that cave as the Leonardo da Vinci of the Ice Age. So I reckon he considered that the artist was a man. And then Gombrich, famous for his book, The History of Art, he just wrote, man is a great miracle, when he wrote of the cave artist. Well, how did they know that the artist was a man? I think what we have to do is reverse engineer what remains of their art, and using the science that we're learning about today, kind of ask ourselves, do these features typify the work of males, or do they typify the work of females? So let's look at some of the themes. Now, probably you've seen images of figurines from these caves. Can you conjure up images of less than slim women, lots and lots of curves? A very famous example is the Venus of Willendorf. And what we notice is the portrayal of a female figure, a lot of round shapes, and a lot of detailing on the head. And because we haven't had too much time today, I haven't had the opportunity to explain that the use of a lot of detail is something that very much typifies the female as against the male aesthetic. Men, if you think of industrial gadgets for the kitchen, they're free of detail. Philips, for example, prides itself on having producing products that are free of detail. And, well, something else, if you're sitting with a pen and paper, you might like to just scribble a figure. I'm not looking for a Rembrandt, just scribble a match figure and give that figure a name. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. Doesn't have to be a Leonardo da Vinci at all, just a stick figure and put a name against it. And you might have done that by now. And if you haven't, pause and then continue. In numerous studies involving sometimes very, very extensive sample sizes, what's been found is that people tend to depict people of their own gender. In other words, people are, well, one interpretation is that people are depicting themselves in one way or another. And that would be a subject for another talk. Very fascinating. It links to art therapy, projective drawings. No time for that today. But 9 times out of 10, people will depict somebody of their own gender. So when we see figurines emerging from caves that depict females, there's a fair chance that the creators of those figurines were actually women rather than men. And, well, there are 4 other factors to consider. We'll whiz through these. And I should just add as a footnote what I've just said, that there are hundreds of these Venus figurines, hardly any figurines depicting men. So on to the next point. There are more expressions of life than there are of violence in the cave paintings. And do you remember what we talked about when we were looking at the drinks cans? That violence is, according to McNeef's study in America, 1982, the drawings of children aged 6 to 8, they found that violence was depicted in 27% of the boys' drawings and in less than 1% of the girls' drawings. So the fact that there are very few portrayals of violence in the paintings in the caves might again suggest a female provenance. And then there are depictions of pregnant animals. Could it be that women who give birth at the moment are more likely to depict pregnant animals than men? And there are depictions of dangerous adversaries, for example, cave bears, lions, but they're shown at peace. They're not shown in any other way than that. And then if we look at the shapes, a lot of the shapes, and we could look at a slide, Lasso, you'll see the curved forms in that. And on the same image, you'll see in Lascaux cave, lots of handprints were left on the cave. And ask yourself, looking at the size of those handprints, whether those are the handprints of men or women, or perhaps children. Many people would suggest that they're much more likely to be the handprints of women or children than of men, given their size. Now, this is very interesting because if women were the artists, it meant that they had very high status at that time. And why do I say that? Because to paint this art was no easy matter. They would have needed to have light in the caves, and to supply that light, they would have had to burn animal fat, precious animal fat. Scaffolding was needed. I mean, at La Bastide in the Pyrenees, there's an immense horse that towers 14 foot above floor level. So clearly scaffolding would have been needed. And in fact, at Lascaux, they've actually found evidence of sockets cut into the walls to support the scaffolding. And in Lascaux, same cave, in the so-called picture gallery, there's a gallery that's more than 100 feet long and 35 feet wide. So you would have needed, I think, a lot of assistance to help. Rouffignac, the caves there were even longer. They ran for 6 miles into the mountain. And some of the collections of drawings are more than 7 feet long. Certainly, the painter needed help. They would have been high status. And finally, the paints would need to have been mixed on a regular basis, since some of the paints used dried very quickly and had to be replaced very quickly. It looks as though, from the evidence, there is a good case for saying that the artists were very likely to have been women. And we shouldn't be surprised if they were high status because, from what I've read, the matriarchal period of society ran right up to about 1570 BC in Egypt. Things changed when the Mesopotamians came into Egypt, and they brought with them the concept of kingship and a male deity. And we could talk a bit more about patriarchy later on. So we can reverse engineer what we see in paintings, perhaps, to learn about history. And perhaps understanding the differences between the male and female design aesthetic helps us understand what we find in fine art, in the world of fine art. So we just quickly make a foray into fine art. If you've got your pen and paper, jot down the percentage of art in the National Gallery in London that you think is the work of men and that you think is the work of females. It's a shame I can't talk to you at the moment, but I think Ben knows already, so I can't ask him the question. Well, I counted up all the paintings on the online catalogue of the National Gallery, and here's what I found. 0.5% of all the paintings in the National Gallery, yes, you heard that right, are the work of women. So 99.5% of the work on display in the National Gallery is the work of men. Now, you might think this was a bit of an oddity, the National Gallery, but if you go to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, it's a slightly higher figure, it's 5%. What do you think is happening here, Ben? Why is so little female work on display when, in reality, it's not that women haven't been painting over centuries, they have. There's a whole museum of women in the arts in Washington, jam-packed full of women's art. So given that there's an awful lot of female painting, why is there so little in art galleries? What could the reasons be?
It's a very good question. The two things that spring to mind is I'd like to know exactly how many male artists make up that 99.5% figure, because actually I'd imagine it's a relatively small number of artists, but I might be wrong. But then the other reason could perhaps be that the people who are making the selections about what goes into the canon are predominantly men, and this becomes a self-perpetuating issue.
Very interesting. So, are you suggesting that they will follow their natural preferences, which is entirely a human thing to do, isn't it? Unless you've been taught otherwise. And over time, collectors have predominantly been men. The people with the disposable income have been men. And so they've tended to buy the works of women. So I think what you're suggesting is very plausible. And then, of course, fine art is taught as a discipline, isn't it? And books are written, and the canon comes into being. And there are casualties, which seems to be half of the human race. There was an art exhibition at the Royal Academy in 2016 called Painting the Modern Garden. There were at least 24 male painters exhibited there, and no more than 2 female artists. And I went to that exhibition because a friend asked me along, and I recall one painting by the French female impressionist sister-in-law of Manet, that's Berthe Morisot, and there were so many other paintings of hers that could have been chosen. There was work by Mary Cassatt, again, so much more of her work could have been chosen. And then there were female artists completely excluded from the exhibition. British Dora Carrington, for example. Tragic life, in a way. Dora Carrington, immense talent at the Slade School of Art. Her life was cut short when her partner, Nishan Strachey, died of stomach cancer, and she killed herself with a bullet a very short while after that. Now, interestingly, I read this about Dora Carrington. Her dates were 1892 to 1932. Her passionate interest in art was deeply intertwined with a suspicion of the forces that make up the traditional canon. So she could have joined us, couldn't she, Ben, perhaps on this discussion, where she not have met that tragic end. And, you could think of so many other artists, Winifred Nicholson, wife of Ben Nicholson, Vanessa Bell. And bear in mind that one of these studies of girls and boys paintings by McCarthy, 1924, that examined a vast sample of drawings, 31,000 of children, produced by children aged 4 to 8. And they found, guess what, that 58% fewer of the boys than the girls' drawings included flowers. So if you were running an exhibition of gardens and flowers, and some of the paintings on the display in that exhibition displayed simply flowers, why would you not home in on the painterly creations of women? It must be for the reasons that you suggest. Although I recall that one of the curators was female of that exhibition. Are we now living in extreme patriarchy? I know this is a subject that interests you because we talked about it yesterday. We're living at a time when much of society is intent on, as you said right at the beginning, denying that biology is what makes women women. And in that denial, we're denying that they perceive the world in any way different from men. And what does that denial do? It blocks female talent because it says there's no difference. And women don't find an outlet for their different talents, which I've talked about, how I've discovered those differences in the course of 20 years of research. To deny biology is to deny nature. And if we deny nature, my goodness, what follows from that? Any thoughts, Ben?
I think that was a wonderful summary, Gloria. Thank you. And that point that you've landed on at the end there is an extremely profound one, because the people who are promoting this idea of there being no intrinsic differences between the sexes are also the ones that are making a lot of noise about their dislike of the patriarchy. And yet what you're saying is that actually their position is a manifestation of the patriarchy. It's in fact extreme patriarchy, which would be rather ironic, actually, in the context of everything that's happening.
And the denial of nature can segue very easily into the transhumanist agenda. And many voices would say that's a place we don't want to go. And I think UK does a fantastic job in putting out information. And it's just so good to have an opportunity to share some of this information about the reality of sex and biology, because knowledge is power, is it not? And to deny biology is to deny nature and to make way for the transhumanist, which is somewhere we don't necessarily want to go. In fact, I'll be having a discussion with Diane about that in a short while. I must say that while I was doing this research over this 20-year period, it felt quite a lonely journey, because there were probably only 2, at most 3 of us in Britain who were doing anything different from agreeing that you could swap your sex. And the going was tough, very tough at times. If you're sort of a group of 1, or at most 2, it's difficult. But I have no regrets about doing this work, because I think it's just so important to find the truth. And critical thinking is the tool that will get us there. Evidence-based critical thinking. And people may not want to listen, but the truth is the truth. And courtesy of UK Column, which I'm very grateful, I wrote an article, well, first of three-part series on post-truth. And you can see there how at times of totalitarianism, truth is very often a casualty, which is why the work of UK Column is so important, putting out truth.
Indeed it is. And thank you, Gloria, for standing up for truth as well. That's been a wonderful discussion, fantastic information. We've covered a huge number of different bases there, and it was wonderfully delivered. So thank you for that. And I feel much more rooted in and understanding of the biological, physiological, psychological, visuospatial differences between the sexes. And I hope you all at home do too. Thanks for watching. Take care.